My name is João. I'm originally from Portugal. I've lived in Denmark for 24 years. I was born in Lisbon. I've only been a vegan for the last 4 years. Like we all more or less sense with the people that we talk to when we are doing outreach, I have the same values as everyone else. The same values that I have today, I had then as well. And now I'm starting to do some public speaking about Anonymous for the Voiceless, and particularly about the Guy Fawkes Mask. And many of the people that are doing outreach, they are confronted with the question that Guy Fawkes was a terrorist, or that the mask is terrifying. And I heard this so many times that I thought people should be more aware of all the elements, not only about outreach, but what it means to be in a cube, where the pictures come from, but the mask. What is the mask all about? But before I get into that, here we have Paul Asal and AsaI PauI. They established Anonymous for the Voiceless since 2016 in Melbourne, Australia. And they were originally inspired by another activist action for the animals, which is called the EarthIings Experience, that was established in 2015, just the year before actually. The conceptual starting point for both the Cube and EarthIings Experience is more or less the same. The main ground difference is that EarthIings Experience has less rules than Anonymous for the Voiceless. These are the Frampton sisters, two sisters from London that in 2015 decided to go to the subway on Valentine's Day. And they sat patiently with laptops showing scenes from the film Earthlings. That's why they call the EarthIings Experience. The first time they did it, in the beginning, they did it briefly without masks, but because people started talking with them all the time and not watching the pictures, they very quickly decided to have some masks on. And you can easily check this out because they have some amazing videos online, the Frampton sisters, they're easy to find. From the positive reactions that they got from the people, both in the subway trains and tunnels, they decided to create the EarthIings Experience. And it was a very spontaneous thing for them. The demos of the EarthIings Experience are very varied, and they can do their actions just about anywhere. They can be sitting on the subway train, on a public bench. They could just go in on supermarkets and do an action there as well. On fur shops, they can be standing on a street or a square in very different formations. And the actions can also be taking a spontaneous initiative of handing leaflets to people. It can be just writing with chalk on the ground or the floor. It can also be you're going to school, you're going to work, you're riding your bike in Copenhagen, and you put an iPad on your back showing pictures of animal abuse. Whatever. Their concept is much more open, let's say, than the Cube of Truth and Anonymous for the Voiceless. And somehow it's more disruptive in nature. It's more informal, actually, than Anonymous for the Voiceless. Another thing which makes the EarthIings Experience more informal is that they make some handwritten and home-printed signs, and they hand out also handwritten and homemade leaflets like these, as well as love heart-shaped memos where sometimes there is earthlings.com and adapt.org as well. Another thing that doesn't happen with the Cube of Truth is that EarthIings Experience, they can interact with people. They can be actually speaking to people from behind the masks as well. I've seen all the other circumstances in which they are in a line formation, they have like 2-3 people, and all of a sudden when someone shows interest about the imagery that they're showing, one of them takes the mask off and starts talking with the person. You can't do that with the Cube of Truth. Another thing with the mask is that any mask can do in EarthIings Experience, not with us. This informality has actually made EarthIings Experience to be somehow at everyone's reach. So you can just go out to the street, or you can just go to work, or be in a coffee shop and all of a sudden decide to make something. And very quickly it started spreading around the world. But this is what they have on their website right now. And apparently it's quite active still. Asal and Bashir, in the beginning in Melbourne, 2016, April 2016, they actually, inspired in EarthIings Experience, they decided also different formations. So the cube was, the square was not something that happened from the start. They were trying stuff out. They tried lines, they tried circles, they tried diamond shapes, but finally by the mid-2016, Asal suggested the square because it seemed to work best and to be more effective. They sharpened the concept and they created also a more controlled atmosphere during 2016, out of the belief that the more professional the activists appear to be, the more serious the public will take them as well. And we can feel that, because the better we get to do outreach, the better we get to be in the cube, the less we move or whatever we do stuff with the hips or whatever, the more the cube works, the more we feel that we put our message through better. The cube started showing graphic footage in HD of animal abuse and also in larger flat screens. So the flat screens were introduced to the cube. Another very important thing was the clothing. Right? The concept got more tight. The clothing has to be black and as uniform as possible. And as you also know, we activists in the cube, in the Anonymous for the Voiceless, we have to be statues and not speak and not move at all. The outreachers are people that have an enormous responsibility to keep the cube in its right formation so that it's attractive and interesting all the time for the bypassers, and so that the concept works. And the whole thing should actually look pretty much like an art, a performance art demonstration. Another important thing is that we shouldn't talk to the bypassers, as you know, unless they show interest for us. And when we talk to the bypassers, the conversations should only be dialogue. We shouldn't engage in debates or discussions. And if it gets into that area, we should just leave the conversation and move on. Unlike EarthIings Experience, the material that we give out with Anonymous for the Voiceless and the Cube is exclusively given by the organization and the organizers. So you can't come with something from home and distribute it to people. Again, for the sake also of being consequent at keeping the concept tight. And the mask as well. The Guy Fawkes Mask was known already as the anonymous mask. But it's important to underline that it is not the anonymous mask. The mask had been there before. It's interesting because when Asal and Bashir went out to start the Anonymous for the Voiceless in Melbourne, and they went to try to find the mask that they should use, their choice fell on this mask, because they felt that there was more to this mask than any other mask. There was a lot of symbolism behind it, already some sort of political and social symbolism connected to the mask. That's why they chose it.
When we started out, we chose the anonymous mask instead of the neutral mask that is used within the EarthIings Experience campaigns. That mask represents within pop culture a movement that fights for truth and stamps out injustice in this world. We know that the vegan message is the biggest truth bomb on this planet right now. And when we chose that anonymous mask, it was just from that point on, we knew that this had to happen, that it was bigger than just the aesthetic of the mask. It was what it symbolized, and the values of the anonymous movement, or the ethos behind it, was right in line with our values, fighting against injustice, stamping out oppression. I mean, there are many pockets within the anonymous movement that fight against different injustices, and they're all important to stamp out. There's human rights injustices, there's government corruption, there's a whole bunch of things that are happening, but we just wanted to provide a good image, but also a very strong image for veganism within the anonymous movement.
What is interesting is that their intuition was right. Not only because it was a mask that had been very much used before, but also during the late 20th century, so not just only recently, but during the late 20th century, the symbolism of the mask actually had developed immensely, and that's what we are going to talk about. Since the 80s, and particularly since 2004, it started symbolizing faceless, anonymous members of the people. That is to say, if I use the Occupy movement's expression of the 99%, actually, of the big anonymous mass that was having common ideals and a common identity, right? So in a sense, this mask started symbolizing that we are all anonymous. But the question is, meet Guy Fawkes. How did this bloke, this Roman Catholic guy from the 17th century, who himself was actually pretty much anonymous in the London of the time, since no one really knew him there then. He was a mercenary and he was fighting in Europe with other Catholics. This guy, he failed at an attempt to kill a Protestant king. He failed at blowing the British Parliament up. And after this, he became one of the most controversial, hated and scorned figures in the history of England. And he had his doll burned in bonfires every year for centuries after his death. So how? How did Guy Fawkes, this pretty guy here, and by the way, this is the Parliament actually, the English Parliament at the time, so not bigger than this house. So how did this Guy Fawkes suddenly turned off to be into the symbol of a worldwide hacker organization, and moreover becoming an iconic figure for anti-repression and anti-totalitarianism? So how did he become a global symbol for rebellion against any kind of discrimination, corruption and oppression, and actually war, against war in the 21st century? So what happened? Who was Guy Fawkes back then? And who is Guy Fawkes today? So around the beginning of the century of the 17th century, Protestant England and Catholic Spain were fighting against each other on and off, very often, over economic, cultural and military and also religious supremacy in Europe. It was the Protestants against the Catholics, Catholic Spain against Protestant England. So the English Catholic citizens at the time, they suffered immensely under Protestant rule. The Catholics were persecuted and they were killed, and very often just on open streets. So to try to change this, the gunpowder plot was created, and this was a rebellious group that had as a sole objective to kill King James I, to blow up the English Parliament, to kill all the lords and representatives. And they wanted to do this in order to allow Catholicism to rule in England once more. It was so hard for the Catholics that they had enough. So in 1605, the members of the gunpowder plot, they placed 36 barrels filled with gunpowder under the House of Lords. Guy Fawkes, this is him, Guido Fawkes. Guy Fawkes, despite being more or less in the middle here, just because he was famous or became famous, he was actually not a central figure in the group, not at all. He actually just happened to be the guy that had the most experience with warfare and the most knowledge with explosives. And he was therefore trusted with the task of acquiring all the material and all the gunpowder and the explosives that were needed to blow up the House of Lords. As you can see here, this is a picture from when they were taking the barrels under the House of Lords. So you should imagine London not as a big town as it is today, but a town with maybe a few 100,000 people, a very small town where everyone knew each other. Guy Fawkes, he was a mercenary in Holland for the Catholics, also a mercenary in Spain. So he was not very often in London nor in England. So no one knew him. So he could just in the night go unnoticed. And the Thames River was actually a very busy river. There was a lot of commerce. England was a very powerful nation. So there were a lot of ships going around. In all anonymity, they could, in the night, transport all these barrels of powder into the House of Lords and not be noticed. But the funny thing was that while the group kept growing in order to make this action possible, the growing of the group made the secret weaker. In fact, to get the powder barrels under the House of Lords, they had to have someone in the group that rented the cellar of the House of Lords so that they could put the powder and the barrels almost unnoticed. the plot was discovered. It was a letter from a well-intentioned person in the periphery of the gunpowder plot group. The group had grown a lot, so there was like a lot of periphery people. And there was a very well-intentioned person that wrote a letter to a member of the parliament who was a member of his family, advising him that it would be wise not to attend parliament on that special day. And that special day was November the 5th, 1605. So here we have Guy Fawkes spreading a trace of powder and with the barrels already in place. So he was alone in the cellar taking care of the barrels. But then, of course, word got out because of this letter very quickly, and he was caught. So the king and the lords were immediately warned, and security went out, and a huge search was set in course, and Guy Fawkes was captured in the cellar with the explosives. So for a few days, Guy Fawkes was actually the only suspect. Later on, he would give in the rest of the gunpowder plot group, that in the meantime, they all had fled to very different places in England. So here we have Guy Fawkes kneeling on the floor in front of King James I. And this was a very unusual situation for a king to talk with a prisoner. But we have to be aware that King James was a person that was expected to have a role to create some sort of truce between the Protestants and the Catholics, actually because his mother, the Queen Mary of Scots, she was a Catholic. But people didn't know exactly if King James I was actually a Protestant king or a Catholic king. So in the beginning of his ruling, he was very much like a person who tried to negotiate. So he wanted to meet this crazy Catholic that was daring to wipe out the monarchy in England. The gunpowder plot, they were all caught, and they were all condemned for high treason against the crown. And they were imprisoned, and now I'm going to get a bit graphic here. At the time, they were not nice with prisoners, especially if they were condemned for high treason against the crown. So what they did to them is that they hanged them to the brink of death, like almost to the point in which they were dead. Right before they were dead, they gutted them alive. They drowned them by horses to the final execution, quartering them alive, that is to say, dismembering in 4 parts. So the prisoners actually would still be alive in the process, so they could see their members and also their genitals and guts being burned in front of themselves. Ultimately, the prisoner would be beheaded, and finally all the parts of the prisoner would be thrown into a bonfire. And you can see here a little bit in detail how it was. They are gutted while they are hanging here almost to the brink of death, and when they can't take it anymore, then they behead the person, they put them on the sticks and throw them in the fire over there. So this was common practice. Fawkes was the last one, and there were many in this group. So Fawkes had to watch all his mates die in this manner before him, and when his turn came, he tried to escape. You see him going up the ladder here, and what happened is that when he was going up, he saw an opportunity to escape. He tried to jump off the ladder, but it ended up doing a bad fall, and actually he broke his neck and died. The interesting thing is that it was a good thing for him that he didn't have to go through all that pain, but nevertheless, the same procedure was executed with the dead and broken-necked Guy Fawkes. The same procedure was executed for the pleasure of the masses, of course, because as you can see here, the whole population and the nobles, it was always a great feast to see these kind of things. In the end, the burned parts of the gunpowder plot and Fawkes would be sent to the whole country to be put in display as a warning to the population not to commit treason against the English crown. The King James I didn't want the Catholics to now think, okay, the Protestants did this, we have to really make a revolution now, this is not something that we should bear. No. He decided to create the Guy Fawkes Night every 5th of November, together with sending the dead parts of these revolutionaries all around England for everyone to see. So he decided to make the Guy Fawkes Night every 5th of November to celebrate the plot's failure, and as a warning for any citizen that dared defying the crown. So the celebration consisted of very big bonfires and people danced around it, so it was pretty much like a carnival. And they were throwing dolls that should represent both Guy Fawkes and the other revolutionaries. And this became a huge feast that spread all over England very quickly. The popularity of the feast was so big at some point that King James I decided to include fireworks in the feast to make it even bigger, to make it more significant. And this is important to note because we live in a time where there was no electricity. So nights were dark, were not just dim, they were really dark. So when you decided to put some fireworks on a festivity, it was because it was of real importance, because nights were lit for a very long time and people could feast. I found an old article of the Times from 1790, where it says that children started running the streets with homemade Fawkes masks, and they would stroll with a Fawkes doll around the streets begging for a penny for the guy. But during the 60s and the 70s in the 20th century, this tradition started dying out, mainly because of Halloween taking over, and also because in the late 20th century, England started having some security concerns, because the kids, with this money, they went to buy fireworks and to burn the doll. So here we see some very old pictures of children creating Guy Fawkes mask. And here we are in the 20th century. Somehow, mostly in the 20th century, with historical distance and the increasing of religious tolerance between Protestants and Catholics, the Guy Fawkes mask started actually morphing into an all-purpose boogeyman. But the tradition still continued in the 20th century. This is actually a picture from New Zealand. In the last 400 years, as England expanded to other continents, the tradition was also taken to these different countries. And it changed character as well. But the Guy Fawkes mask, here we have some dolls made of straw, probably and other materials, but always with a mask on. There had to be a mask on all the time, as you can see here. So this was an important thing. So wherever the tradition went on, the mask was always something that was a constant. You can see another mask here. And this must be from the late 20th century, because these kids, they are not asking just for a penny for the guy. They are asking for 3 pennies for the guy due to the rise of the cost of living. People started making changes to the doll in the 20th century, also before that, but mostly in the 20th century. And somehow Guy Fawkes himself started gradually losing popular interest. Guy Fawkes started actually symbolizing people that were seen in different times and different decades as villains. So it was not Guy Fawkes that was being used all the time. They made other dolls, Guy Fawkes-like dolls, that were villains. And normally they were politicians in these different times. It has been Tony Blair or the Tsar Nicholas I around the Crimean War, William II, the German Kaiser during World War I. Popes are burned, very often Catholic popes. This is James Cameron, former English Prime Minister, and he's holding a head of a pig. Here we have Vladimir Putin in a Borat version. One of the most depicted figures in this November the 5th bonfires was actually Margaret Thatcher. Because in the beginning of the Thatcher era in Britain, people really started having not a good time in England, especially the lower classes. It was so difficult, the life that people had at the time, that graphic novelist David Lloyd said, and I'm quoting, "Celebrating the survival of a corrupt government from many centuries ago and the death of those who tried to undermine it was not such a good thing anymore. Maybe it would have been better if the Houses of Parliament, in fact, had been blown up." Symbolically, he meant this is still a good idea. And there was a reason for him to say this. He meant this because he was getting inspired to create something that would turn the whole idea of the mask and the significance of the mask in later years. Here we have another depiction of Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher the scar. It was the hate around Margaret Thatcher was so big at the time that all the generations today still celebrate the death of Margaret Thatcher. And when she died, actually they burned her depictions as dolls, but and now they have been stopped of doing that. This tells us something, that something very important started happening there in the beginning of the 80s. The graphic novelists David Lloyd, whom I just quoted, and Alan Moore, they created the character V, which was loosely inspired in Guy Fawkes for their graphic novel V for Vendetta. They did so because they saw parallels between the Thatcher years in the 1980s and what happened 300 years ago when Guy Fawkes was living at the time, with persecution of the Catholics and an enormous dissatisfaction. There was, in both periods, there was a strong, widespread feeling of social injustice, back then and also in the 1980s. There was also a feeling of oppression and persecution, and there were also huge rates of unemployment. There was violence in the streets. As I said before, the Catholics would, if someone was suspected to be a Catholic, they could just be killed in the streets. And there was a repressive, harsh, authoritative, ultra-conservative rule in both years, in both times. So the difference was that now we don't have a Protestant king against the Catholics, but instead what was considered by many an autocratic iron lady ruling against its people. So in a time when Fawkes was apparently losing popular significance and interest, when social injustice against the working class and social minorities was at its highest in England in the 1980s, Fawkes was, and the Mask was actually recovered by these two graphic novelists by making the dystopian graphic novel V for Vendetta. By using the Thatcher's years as an inspiration and also a little bit of the Nazi Germany years in the 1930s, these two novelists created the character V, placing the character V in an England of the future, under a despotic, fascistic rule. And V, the character, he felt oppression as much as the Catholic Guy Fawkes of his time. And V was fighting against any social political injustice, any sort of political injustice, whether it was against immigrants, against Muslims, whether it was against homosexuals or terrorists or disease-ridden degenerates, like V actually, during the story, actually was at some point. So the character V adopted the Guy Fawkes persona and mission. So Lloyd and Moore designed V also to resemble Guy Fawkes in his appearance as a modernized version of Guy Fawkes, dressed attractively in black garments and having flares of the 17th century fashion. V was also a great fighter, and Fawkes, as I said before, was an experienced mercenary soldier alongside the Catholics in different places in Europe. But V was also an expert in explosives, which Fawkes also was. V also had a very distinctive trait. He never took his porcelain mask off, never. And in the graphic novel, the man V, through his mask, becomes the embodiment, and this is very important, becomes the embodiment of an ideal, becomes the symbol for popular rebellion against tyranny. V and Guy Fawkes becomes the symbol for a new political culture and becomes also a symbol for social freedom and justice regardless of ideologies. So, in the beginning of the 80s, Guy Fawkes acquired a new momentum. So Guy Fawkes was recovered by being transformed into a fictional character. So the Fawkes Mask became also an icon of the people's aspiration for a better world. This graphic novel that you see here became a huge cult success in the 80s. It was not until 2006 that the Wachowskis decided to make a very successful adaptation of the novel to the cinema. A new mask was designed for the film, and it was here that actually the mask became a worldwide phenomenon. This happened particularly due to the last scene of the film, where a large crowd of thousands of Londoners decided to occupy most of London or of central London in an act of solidarity with the film's hero, in an act of defiance, of popular unity against the dictatorship that existed in the story of this film. In a way, by doing this, the crowd, dressing the garments of V and using the mask of V that V had sent to the whole population in London for the period of 12 months, the population was signaling the need and demand for change. Change of the very fundaments that dictatorial society in the film was based upon. And now we are going to see some film.
It's time. Tell me, do you like music, Mr. Finch?
That music.
Yes. His music. Who's Edmund Dantes? And who's my father? And my mother? My brother? My friend? Who is you? And me? Who's all of us? No one will ever forget that night and what it meant for this country. But I will never forget the man and what he meant to me.
In the later part, when the parliament is blowing up, the police officer asks, who was he? And she says, among other things, he was me, he was you, he was everyone else. He was hope. So if anyone asks you, why are we using this terrorist mask, it's a big discussion. Where's the thin line between terrorism and freedom fighting, right? But this is another discussion and another talk. But in fact, Guy Fawkes is considered a freedom fighter. So the Guy Fawkes mask originated in the 17th century in a tradition created after the death of Guy Fawkes, a renegade Catholic. It then had different shapes and forms throughout the centuries in popular festivities, as we saw. Then, among others, the November the 5th all over England and the English-speaking nations. In the end, it inspired the artists David LLoyd and Alan Moore to create the graphic novel. And the graphic novel then became a film, which then really spread out massively the mask around 2005 or 6, I think it was. And it was actually because of this last scene, the mask ended up inspiring the internet vigilante group that everyone knows as Anonymous. Anonymous, the internet hacker organization, is a leaderless organization, as you know, which consists of unknown, well, they're pretty much known, many of them now, because Secret Service and FBI have been after them. But formerly unknown anarchic users that have the same practice of disrupting governments, institutions and corporations in cyberspace in the name of freedom and freedom of speech. But before going into actually Anonymous and the development, other developments with the mask, we have to talk about this guy, the Epic FaiI Guy, is he called, because before V for Vendetta, this guy started being spread as a general symbol of internet activism and protest. This Epic FaiI Guy was a sort of character, strange character, who was bound to fail, whatever he did. He was bound to fail at everything. And also, he was bound to make other people fail. So he was very much of a troll, an internet troll, you can say. He was corrosive and disruptive and self-ironic. This Epic FaiI Guy was an expert at trolling everything and everyone. So, like I said, it's a bit unclear when it kind of appeared, because it appeared all of a sudden online on the forum FOR Chan, which is a sort of a limitless image posting message board thing, from which actually Anonymous grew from, right? So the Epic FaiI Guy could actually, in fact, be used by any computer geek, not Greek, but geek, any computer geek from anywhere in the world, you know, and just troll and disrupt anything that happened online. In January 2008, this is the Epic FaiI Guy in another depiction. Yeah, he was about to ruin threads all the time. So whenever, imagine yourself on Facebook and all of a sudden this guy appearing from anywhere. It could be a guy in Japan, in South Africa, in Brazil, whatever. And anyone, anywhere, would just have the habit of disrupting any conversation at all if they come across any. So that's what he did. Then he was used in a very concrete way in January 2008 when Anonymous started the Operation ChanoIogy, a series of protests and pranks and hacks which were meant to target the Church of Scientology. And this is not just by chance, because the Church of Scientology in 2006, if I'm not mistaken, they demanded YouTube to erase a video by Tom Cruise where he was talking about the practices of the Church of Scientology. So they wanted the video removed. So the Anonymous organization, they decided to make a live protest action for the very first time. So they decided to encourage people to protest around the world in front of Scientology churches all over the world, wearing, what else? Guy Fawkes masks, in the name of democracy and freedom of speech, information and knowledge. So, according to the documentary We Are Legion, one of Anonymous' spokesmen said, and I'm quoting, "We wanted to represent anonymity in some way when we moved into real life. So I think," he thought, "that the Guy Fawkes mask was one of the most natural things to happen, not by chance. It was the time in which the character V was very popular because of the Hollywood film. And the character V was always anonymous, in fact, behind the mask. He never took the mask off, never. And again, the Fawkes mask and the film at that time was in everyone's mouths. And the mask with the figure of the Epic FaiI Guy had already previously been used as a symbol in different forums online, connected to Anonymous for some time. So for all these three reasons, it was kind of obvious that they didn't choose any other mask. They decided to choose this one because Guy Fawkes and V were so much up to date at the time. So what is happening here now? What happens is that the Guy Fawkes mask becomes a growingly widespread mask, and it starts being used all over the world. So it starts having a subversive effect. It becomes a sort of an identity. People understand that they share an identity behind the use of the mask, and what is shared is non-conformity with the establishment. And here is the fight against a huge institution, the Church of Scientology. So this action targeting Scientology and the other subsequent actions made by Anonymous after ended up receiving a huge amount of attention of the world media, right? And that's how the mask got out there very powerfully. The Fawkes Mask became known as the Anonymous Mask because of this live action that the Anonymous organization made for the first time. The mask became a symbol of protest and a symbol of fighting for righteous causes of freedom. And then we move on to 2008. This Scientology action was around 2006-07. In 2008, we have the financial crisis. And here we have another development of the mask. With the advent of the financial crisis, the mask started being used by different forms of popular street protest. So here we have, for example, people making an action against the MP's expenses in London, against financial corruption in the British government. Then we have Occupy Wall Street. We are the 99%. This is London again, against protest against the crash of the financial markets. If a corporation were really a person, it would be a sociopath. I think we can all relate to that. And this is from the Occupy Wall Street movement. This is Occupy London. Trust me, I'm a banker. Trust me, he's a banker. So you can see the mask is all the time associated with criticism and disruption of the established order. This is Poland, and actually this is members of the parliament in Poland that are against the signing of the ACTA initiative that never came through, fortunately, which was an initiative meant to create censorship on the internet, disguised as ownership and copyright ownership and so on. This is Sweden. Here we have the mask again. This is India, against censorship of the internet, as you say there in the back. This is Bahrain. This is the Arabian Spring. This is a beautiful picture where a veiled woman decides to put the mask on. Very daring in such countries. This is the Middle East. This is Egypt. Arabian Spring. Egypt, of course. Egypt again. This is Thailand. You know, and the people were making homemade masks, like homemade Guy Fawkes mask. So people were spontaneously using the mask also in places in the world where they didn't know where the mask came from. They hadn't seen the film, they hadn't read the novel, they didn't know about Guy Fawkes at all. But the mask spread itself very quickly as a symbol of justice, of liberty, of freedom of speech. This is Turkey. This is Brazil. This is Greece. This is Julian Assange putting the mask on, Julian Assange from WikiLeaks, putting the mask on as a sign of solidarity with the Occupy movement in London. And he's being asked by the police to take the mask off, so he had to take the mask off. He was already a prisoner of the establishment. This is San Salvador. This is Spain. And these are the years 2009 to 2013, right? This is China, France, Vienna, in Austria, Venezuela, and Venezuela again. A very beautiful, creative mask. So if we again come back to Anonymous for the Voiceless and the mask, in the website of Anonymous for the Voiceless, it says, "We have been brainwashed with speciesism. We choose this mask because this mask is against discrimination, corruption, and war." This is what I gather Asal and Paul wrote as a statement on the website. And it connects very much with the feeling they had in the beginning, spontaneous feeling they had in the beginning, that this mask was right for the kind of actions that they wanted to make from 2016 and on. So they established in April 2016 Anonymous for the Voiceless, and from April to October, the Cube operated solely in Melbourne. And after they moved to Thailand, Paul and Asal, after they moved to Thailand in September 2016, and after organizing the first 17 events in Melbourne, Asal and Paul focused on making Anonymous for the Voiceless global. So the first chapter established outside Melbourne actually was in Chicago, and the second one in the Gold Coast, which is a town by Brisbane in Australia. And this happened in October 2016. In fact, both towns contacted Paul and Asal to help them establish the first chapters outside Melbourne after they saw the actions of Melbourne on the social media. Copenhagen was actually number 3. So we have a lot to thank to Kasper Novak. Was actually number 3 to be established outside of Melbourne, but actually was actually the second international town in the whole world to have a Cube of Truth. Sydney, ironically enough, was only established in December, and I suppose Sydney is probably one of the biggest centers for the Cube of Truth actions. I think they're running with 3-4 actions in Sydney. Since then, the Anonymous for the Voiceless has grown exponentially, advocating for an abolitionist animal liberation view every single week. Only in 2 years, Anonymous for the Voiceless has established 750 chapters since the Cube started going global. So what is it that makes the Cube so effective, and what is it that makes non-activists want to become activists in the Cube? What does the Cube of Truth, how does the Cube of Truth give a voice to the victims of animal exploitation, a situation which is too horrific to be expressed in words? And where and how do we find the words, and how do we best communicate them? Through empathy, that's my suggestion. Through dialogue, through empathy, through understanding. Because when dealing with such unspeakable acts as those that humans are committing against other animals, a solution has to be to address the values, like I said to you in the beginning, the values that are common to everyone, so that we can start developing a narrative that helps other people understand the other living beings, the other sentient individuals, which are different from us but are equal. Simply because empathy is in fact a core capacity that any human being has as a fundamental element of our identity. We use it in our daily lives without thinking about it every single day in different situations. But as you know, because of our way of life, we learn to select whom we should not show empathy to, and accept that this is a normal thing. So normal that it's not seen as cruelty any longer, as a lack of compassion, nor a lack of empathy. So it is just pure disconnection. It's a disconnection from our planet, a disconnection from all animals, with the exception of pets maybe, and most definitely and ultimately a disconnection from ourselves, our true selves. So as you know, the Cube has in place a number of very simple techniques that, if well used, are in fact very effective, both per se and particularly in connection with each other, to address the unspeakable. And this is one of them. One of the reasons why the Cube is so effective, this is an amazing picture that I found from a Cube in France. One of the reasons why it works so well is because it has this very strong performance art inspired concept. The fixed formation, the collective human statue, the same color, the neutral position, the same type of signs, the same type of screens, the similarity in clothing. There's no diversions, there's no distractions. And this immobility and this uniformity is absolutely crucial to draw the attention of the bypasser in the most effective way. So that the shocking material that we see we see in the screens goes through, right? And all this associated to the Guy Fawkes mask with all its symbolism that we've just talked about, with the weight of all its symbolism and the ironic smile that it has, I have it that it's a unique combination, and this is extremely powerful. So that's why being behind the mask is as significant as being outside, being an outreacher, Because in fact, if this doesn't work, nothing else works. So this really has to work, right? And because when we are behind the masks, right, because we're doing animal activism, it's not just us, ourselves, the people who are behind the masks. When we are behind the masks, it's also together with the trillions of animals that are killed every year and waiting for justice and freedom, you would say, right? The other aspect which is very effective is the Socratic method, of course, and closely associated with a value-based speech technique. I'm just rounding it up, so I'm not doing an outreach workshop here. It's just to round it up. Because both neither the Socratic method and the value-based sales speech, in its nature, they should not be imposive or invasive or an invasive form of dialogue, right? So that's why it's so important that we have this rule in the Cube of Truth that we should approach people softly. We should address ourselves to the bypassers only if they stop to watch the footage and if they show interest to engage in a conversation with us. And this very soft method of approach works very well with upfront but soft and opening questions like, have you seen this footage before? You all know this. Would you like to know why we're here? Many of the outreachers I see online, some of the most experienced, they always ask this question, would you like to know why we're here, right? Do you think that animal exploitation is wrong, right? There's like general questions. It's a way of starting a conversation very openly. But these questions, they already help you, those who are outreachers, to grasp an understanding of the situation in which the bypasser is in, right? And it helps to define which issues or problems could be found in the dialogue and interaction to be had. So it's pretty much like mapping, right? Possible short-term and long-term obstacles in a dialogue in which we have to address a lot of suffering and a lot of death of other individuals. So helping the bypasser to understand the reasons why Anonymous for the Voiceless is there and why the Cube's message is important is a valuable thing and of crucial importance. Initially, it's most attainable by using our ability to listen, by truly understanding where people are. We are outreachers, we want to drown people in facts and information, but it's sometimes not the most useful thing because we have to feel and understand what are the thoughts that these bypassers have about what they are experiencing at that moment and take that as a starting point. A good way of asserting the bypassers eventually emotional and intellectual blockages in relation to farmed animals is to use the technique feel, felt, and found. It's a method that you can say, well, I understand how you feel, even if people are saying something obnoxious, right? You go, I understand how you feel. I actually felt the same way, which for many of us is actually very much true. But what I found is that it's a very effective way of getting there because you kind of establish, you kind of give the other person the impression that you're opening up, that you're becoming intimate with that person. Because when this trust is established between both parts, you as outreachers are able to deliver solutions and sell the bypasser both the moral value connected to not consuming animals, as well selling the bypasser the value of choosing a totally cruelty-free lifestyle, a vegan lifestyle, emphasizing how much the bypasser would benefit from it. And this can also be done associated to the Socratic method, which is a form of cooperative dialogue. You ask questions in order to stimulate some critical thinking, and the outreacher should help the bypasser to reach the wished conclusions, what you can call actually the vegan answers. I think it says on the Anonymous for the Voiceless's website. They should reach the vegan answers on their own, which is actually not that difficult. The answer should be, do you think there is a humane way to kill an animal that doesn't want to die? What's the difference between eating a dog and a pig? Do we need animals to survive? And so on and so on. And most people tend to give the same answers as vegans do, actually. Because like I said in the beginning, we all have the same core values. Some of us are just a bit more distracted than others. And this creates the conditions to start paving the path to the conclusion without the person to the conclusion that we want them to get to, without the person feeling that they are being told to feel in a different way, or that they're being told to think in a specific way. In this way, the bypasses can acknowledge that the answer given is their own genuine answer. So that's more solid, right? It's also important that we don't get emotional about stuff that people say. And it's important that we are good at, or get better at reasoning, to eventually deconstruct the arguments that people come from the bypasser. Because in this way we start slowly unveiling the cognitive dissonance we all talk about in most people, in their way of looking at animals. So how do we combine both methods? I would say that different activists and different outreachers have different talents, and you should just go for that one which is best or more suitable for you. Some people are more into the sales-oriented thing, other people are more into the empathic dialogue, creating a very close heart-like connection with the other person, and at some point you kind of start getting good at mixing both. So every interaction with people is also different, and the style changes, and the dialogue strategy also has to change, as well as according to the person which is in front of you. Some people can be extremely difficult, others can be very easy. And I personally mean that you should mix as much as possible these techniques. While I was writing this talk, I was in contact with Kasper Novak and Michael Moorberg quite often, asking a lot of stuff about the Socratic method, and also Alex Bez online. So Michael said, you could say that the Socratic method, and I'm quoting him, is used to open people up by making them resonate for the mistakes of their own logic. So you kind of open their hearts a little bit. And once the door is open, you use the value-based sales technique to fill them in with a desire to continue with veganism. So you open their heart and then you sell the values. You sell the veganism and you get them to understand that it's just not only the thing of becoming a vegan, but it's the thing that is something that's going to be extremely beneficial for them and everyone around them and the planet and so on. All right. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.